let's break down what wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, and tight ends you can still add last minute on the waiver wire moving into week 4 of 2024 fantasy football that will have an immediate impact this week to help you bring home a victory. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 4 NFL pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new customers who sign up with promo code DCatch a free Lamar Jackson over half of a total yard pick'em to use towards week 4's action. And on top of that, Underdog's also giving all new customers who sign up with promo code DCatch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. So that's a free pick'em, as well as up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code DCatch. All right, we're going to kick off the video with wide receiver Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. When I put together the video, he's sitting at 21% rostered. He's moved up to 23% rostered at the time I'm recording this. The main reason we're targeting Michael Wilson is because he is going up against the Washington Commanders this weekend, the worst secondary in all of fantasy football, but the best secondary to start wide receivers against. They are giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So we look across this roster. I mean, obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr. is probably due, or not, well, not due, but set for a big day this Sunday. But then we look, who else on this team can have an impact against this secondary? Greg Dortch, potentially, but Michael Wilson is the true wide receiver 2 for the Cardinals. And on top of that, tight end Trey McBride gets a lot of volume, obviously, is out with a concussion. So Michael Wilson's role in this game that should actually be competitive is going to be amplified, right? And that's the nice thing about this Commanders team is that their offense is picking up, right? Pushing back against other teams, but their defense is still awful. So it creates a really good game script, especially in the passing game. Look back the past couple weeks, we haven't just seen the primary wide receiver 1 against the Washington Commanders have big days. I mean, we have, but we've also seen guys like Yoshi, Wan'dale Robinson, Chris Godwin have good fantasy days, score touchdowns against the secondary in the past 3 weeks. So I don't think it's just Marvin Harrison Jr. who's going to have a good day against the Commanders. So a lot of injuries out there, a lot of panic overall right now in the fantasy community. If you need someone to plug in, whether it's in the flex or, at this point, even at the wide receiver 2 spot, Michael Wilson is a great addition moving into week 4. Next up, we just mentioned Yoshi, and we're going to talk about him going into week 4. He's been a player that was talked a lot about going into weeks 1, 2, and 3. But he only sits at 33% rostered at the time I'm recording this, and he's hit double-digit fantasy points in the last 2 weeks and has had 3 total touchdowns. So I do think that, T. Higgins coming back in week 3, 6 targets, 3 receptions, is definitely a player who could continue to ramp up volume. We obviously know what T. Higgins brings to the table and still had 2 red zone targets in week 3's matchup against the Commanders, but Yoshi's just been super involved. Ended up with 7 targets last week, 4 the week before, and 3 total touchdowns off of those 11 targets. So this week, going up against the Carolina Panthers, I just think that there's a strong chance that Yoshi, who's averaged 12.2 fantasy points on the season so far, continues to be involved. We're not saying that Chase and Higgins and even guys like Gesicki and, their running backs are not going to be involved, but it seems like Burrow and Yoshi have a really good chemistry, especially in the red zone. Then they get a good matchup against the Carolina Panthers, who are now potentially one of these teams that offensively is going to create some pushback as well with Andy Dalton slinging the football. So if you're desperate, you don't have anything else out there, you're dealing with some of the injuries that have popped up in the past 24 hours or so for the weekend, then Yoshi, I do think, is a viable fantasy option to go ahead and pick up and plug in moving into week 4. Speaking of the Carolina Panthers, I do think that wide receiver Xavier Legette in his rookie season is worth adding, sitting at 37% rostered. We just saw the passing volume for the Panthers take a huge uptick against the Raiders in week 3 with Andy Dalton at quarterback. Obviously, Deontay Johnson, 14 total targets in week 3. And then before he got hurt, Adam Thielen was heavily involved in the first half as well. But we know Adam Thielen's going to miss week 4. And actually, at the time of recording this, Deontay Johnson is listed as questionable with a groin injury. So either way, we're going to see an uptick in volume for Xavier Legette in week 4. I don't think it's going to be Jonathan Mingo. I mean, he's still sitting as a wide receiver 3 on this team, but I also think that Xavier Legette is just far more talented than Jonathan Mingo and is going to be able to make more out of the opportunities that he's going to get. We don't really have a strong tight end on this team. Ja'Tavion Sanders and Tommy Tremble, maybe a little bit of volume there. We obviously know that Chuba Hubbard is going to see an increase in overall volume on the ground, but not really crazy in the receiving game, although it was improved. It seems like everything was improved with Andy Dalton at quarterback, but Chuba has had 5 targets in the last 2 games. But everything is there for Xavier Legette to walk away with a much improved overall fantasy day. I don't know if I necessarily want to plug in Xavier Legette and start him this week, but I do think he's a really good stash. And then if you were absolutely desperate enough in a deep enough format, as long as it's full PPR, then maybe I'd be okay with it. I get that some of us are in tough situations going into Sunday's action, but I will say I like Legette more if Deontay Johnson is starting. Less defensive pressure for him as the wide receiver 2. We'll see. Either way, he's in line for more volume this week and has a nice matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals at home in week 4. All right, and speaking of injuries for the weekend, Davante Adams is going to miss week 4 dealing with a hamstring injury, and that's going to put Jakobi Meyers in line as the wide receiver 1 for the Raiders this weekend. He's coming off of a 21.2 fantasy performance against the Panthers, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 62 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So this is just one of those things we're purely looking at the fact that Adams is out, and that means that Jakobi Meyers is acting as the wide receiver 1 going into this weekend's action. So might look at this matchup against the Browns and be a little bit worried, but don't be worried. They're still bottom 12 against the wide receiver position in fantasy football, giving up the 20th most fantasy points to the position so far on the season. So, obviously him coming out as a wide receiver 1 is going to see the most defensive pressure, but still Meyers is just in line for an increase in volume. It's a home game here for the Raiders coming off of a loss against the Panthers. This is a good spot for Jakobi Meyers. He is sitting at 52% rostered. I mean, this is a little bit more of a player that actually is rostered in terms of players we're looking at today. But if he's out there, if he's available, I do think he's absolutely worth starting as a flex option moving into the week. And if he's not available, in similar fashion, you could take a shot on Tre Tucker of the Raiders as well. Not as crazy about this one, kind of an underwhelming rookie season last year for Tre Tucker, but he's coming off of a big fantasy performance in week 3. 22.6 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 96 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So a solid day for Tucker in week 3 against the Panthers. He's going to be in line for more volume this week. So I do think if you're desperate enough, you could roll with Tre Tucker, but I would like this move a little bit more in deeper formats for fantasy managers that just have no better option. All right, last wide receiver I want to mention is Wan'dale Robinson of the New York Giants. Now, depending on your league's waiver settings, you might not be able to add Robinson until Wednesday's waivers roll around. But if you're in a league where you can add players who have played in Thursday Night Football this week already, then you should absolutely pick up Robinson. Obviously, we can't play him here in week 4. He already played Thursday night's game. But Robinson has made the early waiver wire video every single week of the season so far, and 11.8 points in week 1, 9.8 in week 2, 13.1 in week 3, 18.1 in week 4. His best fantasy performance of the year against Dallas, the most targets in the game so far, and the most receptions, as well as the most receiving yards at 14, 11, and 71. Now we're also seeing rookie wide receiver Malik Neighbors, who's been an absolute stud this year, deal with a concussion after that kind of awkward hit and fall that he had towards the end of the game. Hope it's a speedy recovery for him and the concussion protocol and everything. But right now, Neighbors is set to potentially miss week 5, which is going to leave Robinson with an uptick in volume. And even if it doesn't, Robinson has just been way too involved. He's a top 25 wide receiver in fantasy at the time I'm recording this. So he's got to be a player that we're adding to our rosters. Obviously can't start him this week. Maybe we're not even starting him next week against Seattle, but he needs to be higher than 46% rostered as we get closer to week 5. All right, let's move along to the running back position, and we're going to talk about Cam Akers again, moving into week 4. Time I put together the video, he's at 45% rostered. He's moved up a little bit now at the time recording this to 49% rostered. But if you are struggling at the running back position, dealing with injuries, whatever it may be, maybe you're struggling at the wide receiver position with some of the injuries popping up, you need a flex play. I know Cam Akers was underwhelming as a start last week, but that was against what is right now the best defense in football, the Minnesota Vikings, and he still had 9.9 fantasy points. Not good, but he did score a receiving touchdown. And here in week 4, he gets a completely different team, the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have been god-awful defensively all season long, and they are bottom 5 against the running back position. In terms of fantasy points allowed, they come in at the 28th most points allowed to the running back position. So this is a home game for the Texans. They just got beat down by the Vikings. Should create for a good game script for Cam Akers. It's a great matchup. Joe Mixon is out. Everything is here for Cam Akers to walk away with double-digit fantasy points. He's a good flex play. He's a great RB2 play if you are needy at either position. Running back we're going to talk about is Roschon Johnson, sitting at 38% rostered. Had 10.2 fantasy points last week, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 32 receiving yards, 30 yards on the ground. And then we're starting to get these reports that the Bears are going to expand Roschon Johnson's role this weekend. So I want to kind of, be a little bit careful with this one because those are just reports. We don't know that for sure. But when we look at the rest of these running backs on this team, it's just been so incredibly underwhelming that I think Roschon Johnson's worth a shot starting, coming off of a double-digit fantasy performance, but then also just because, DeAndre Swift, Khalil Herbert, it just hasn't been there. It does actually make plenty of sense for the Bears to want to get another running back involved, and Roschon Johnson could certainly be a viable running back for them. But also, it's kind of tough because when we look at things, this is just still a bad offensive line. So I want to be really careful with this one. It is a very good matchup against the Rams is the other reason that I want to mention it. They are giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the running back position. So still a bottom 10 defense against the position when it comes to fantasy points allowed. The Rams have been very bad, but the other thing is the Bears are going to play the Panthers and the Jaguars in the next 2 weeks after this week 4 matchup against the Rams before they hit their week 7 bye. So if the guy is Roschon Johnson, he's got fantastic matchups coming up and we want to try and secure him now. So am I crazy about starting him this weekend? No. Could you if you're desperate? Yes, either way, he's a fantastic stash with the upcoming schedule and could pop if he is truly more involved in week 4. All right, another Saturday and another mention of Alexander Mattison of the Raiders, sitting at 46% rostered. He's either had double-digit fantasy points or a touchdown in every game so far this year. I talked about it, and on the waiver wire video early in the week, and I said, whether we like it or not, this is the running back to own when it comes to the Raiders' backfield. It's not Zamir White. Now, not a great matchup for Mattison this weekend. The Browns are allowing the 13th fewest fantasy points to the position. It's not awful, but certainly not great. So this is more, it's what it's been every week. If you're desperate, you need someone to throw in. That's part of the reason why we make this video at the end of the week. Mattison is still a guy who can throw in. He's averaged 11.9 fantasy points per game on the season. Okay matchup, not the best. Like I said, he's either got you double-digit fantasy points or at least scored a touchdown in every game this year. He's getting all the goal line work for the Raiders. They're coming off of a loss. This is just an okay spot for Alexander Mattison. Once again, you don't need to go out and put him in over a starter, obviously, but with all the injuries mounting up again here in week 4, Mattison, if you got nothing better, you can at least plug in and cross your fingers for a touchdown. All right, last running back I'm going to mention is Emanuel Wilson of the Green Bay Packers, a player we talked about in last week's video. And last week had 16.5 fantasy points, had that nice receiving touchdown, 4.17 yards per carry, 50 yards on the ground. Do I think he's necessarily going to do that against the Minnesota Vikings? Probably not, but I do think that there is a real potential for a situation where Jacobs and Emanuel Wilson are both getting touches. Maybe we see something, just for comparison, close to what Breece Hall and Braylon Allen are producing. And, you look back over Matt LaFleur's coaching history, he likes a committee backfield. So I really won't be surprised if Emanuel Wilson starts to get more and more touches, especially as, we are entering kind of this mid-season, right? We are probably going to see potentially teams look at a player like Josh Jacobs and want to try and preserve his health as the season goes on. So I would still err on the side of caution. I'm not going to really throw Emanuel Wilson into a starting lineup unless I'm absolutely desperate, especially against a defense like the Vikings. But I'll have some better opportunities. We got the Rams, the Cardinals, and the Jaguars all coming up in the next 4 weeks. So definitely some potential to start Wilson if you're absolutely desperate. But of course, at the end of the day, the main reason I talked about Wilson last week is because I just think he's a super strong handcuff to Josh Jacobs. So if anything happens to Jacobs, and with all the injuries we're seeing this year, maybe something does happen. Hope nothing does happen, but that's going to make Wilson extremely valuable in fantasy football. So he's a great stash, and he might really start to actually offer some flex appeal if we see what we saw in week 3 continue. Moving along to the tight end position, we're going to talk about Brenton Strange, just like we talked about last week. Evan Ingram is officially ruled out for Sunday's action against the Texans, still dealing with that hamstring injury. Brenton Strange, the tight end 11 right now in fantasy football. 5 targets, 2 receptions, a touchdown in week 3. 9.2 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 receptions, 65 receiving yards, 9.5 fantasy points in week 2. So is Brenton Strange going to bring a super high ceiling with no Evan Ingram out there? No, probably not. But is he going to produce a safe enough floor? Yes. And with him having 0 catches, 0 targets in week 1, and just having the last 2 weeks under his belt, like I said, he's the tight end 11. That is how bad the tight end play has been this year on the season so far. He hasn't even hit double digits once this year. And he's only averaging 6.2 fantasy points per game. He's the tight end 11. I mean, there's just not good options out there. So if you're dealing with one of these injuries, Ingram, Njoku, McBride, whoever, then Brenton Strange is a player that you can pick up, plug in. He's going to bring that floor, and you're just going to have to move forward and take what you can get. It's a wasteland at the position this year. At least he offers some value, very lowly rostered if you need a tight end to plug in for week 4. Another tight end I like going into the week who's sitting at 28% rostered is Tyler Conklin of the New York Jets, coming off of his first double-digit performance on the season in week 3. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 93 receiving yards, 18.6 yards per catch, and 14.3 fantasy points in week 3. A little bit of a tough matchup against the Broncos here in week 4 for the Jets. We know that Pat Surtain's probably going to be locking Garrett Wilson down, going to make it hard to throw the football. Aaron Rodgers going to have to look to some of the additional receiving options on this team. So we know Allen Lazard, Mike Williams have been picking up slowly as well, but we really saw Tyler Conklin pick up in week 3 and some nice chemistry kind of start to bloom between Rodgers and Conklin. So Conklin is the tight end 14 on the season. Once again, that's how bad things are. 1.6 points in week 1, 2 in week 2, 14.3 in week 3, and he's a top 15 player at the position. I don't know if he can even start anyone outside of a top 15 play, except for some of those, injured superstars at the position. But there's not a lot of good options. That's just how the tight end position is this year. If you need someone to plug in, I think Tyler Conklin is as good as a bet as you're going to get for a safe floor going into week 4. Let's move along to the quarterback position. Justin Fields is my quarterback to pick up and stream for the week, sitting at 38% rostered, coming off of a 19.4 fantasy performance in week 3 against a good Chargers defense. This week he gets the Colts. Not a good defense in general. It is a road game here for the Steelers. And, I still think you have a limited ceiling with Justin Fields right now. But week by week, we've just seen this offense start to open up a little bit more. We saw Fields' best fantasy performance in week 3, like I just said. Touchdown through the air, touchdown on the ground. And I think in week 4 against the Colts, a team that is struggling against the pass and against the run, giving up the 19th most fantasy points to the quarterback position, we could easily see Fields' highest ceiling so far of the season. This team is really bad against the run, and I think that Fields is going to be able to take advantage of that. So if you're struggling at the position, you need someone to pick up and stream. You're in a super flex, double quarterback league, whatever. You need someone to plug in. I think Fields is a very strong start for the week if you need to pick up someone off the waiver and plug them in. And we had to mention him. We're going to end the video with the Red Rifle himself. 24.5 fantasy points in week 3, 319 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. And he gets one of his former teams, the Bengals, at home in week 4. The Bengals bottom 12 against the quarterback position so far on the season, giving up the 20th most fantasy points to the position. Listen, I still think there's risk involved here. We've only seen Dalton play 1 game this year. But this Bengals defense has been struggling to start this season. I don't have a lot of confidence in them. I think it's a good spot for Andy Dalton at home here. It looks like everyone's going to be good to go. I mean, Dalton has been dealing with an ankle injury. He should be fine. Like I mentioned earlier, Deontay Johnson dealing with a groin injury, but it looks like he's going to be good as well. He's got enough options here, even with Adam Thielen missing, this game and next couple of weeks as well. Dalton, if you need someone to plug in, if you're in a super flex, double quarterback league, you need someone to throw in at that spot. He's only sitting at 17% rostered, even coming off of that big fantasy performance last week, because I think a lot of fantasy managers are still erring on the side of caution here, which makes sense. But I'm going to go ahead and say Dalton is a solid stream moving into week 4. That'll do it for today's video. Guys, don't forget I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 4 of the season, drop it down below. I'll make sure all comments are answered before Sunday's action kicks off. And don't forget, guys, we have everything that you guys need for week 4 here on the channel. Starts, sits at every single position. Running backs, wide receivers that you can't afford to bench, buy low, trade options, must-start defenses, must-start kickers, and an early waiver video out for the week already on top of our fantasy Q&A live streams throughout the week. So make sure you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.